everyone. This is Pastor Dan back again with Pastor's Corner. And we are a member of New Life Christian Center. So, today I got something really unique for you. I want to tell you about this story of 350 donuts. Now, there is a few versions of this story that exist. And I'm unsure if it's actual or fictional. However, it does make a good point. And also the authorship to this is uncertain too, so let me get into this story with you. Grab your snacks. Here we go. Now, there was this boy by the name of Steve who was attending school in Western State. And Mr. Christensen taught at this particular school. He had an open door policy and would take in any student that had been thrown out of another class, as long as they would abide by his rules. Steve had been kicked out of his 6th period and no other teacher wanted him, so he went into Mr. Christensen's class. Steve was told that he could not be late, so he arrived just seconds before the bell rang, and he would sit in the very back of the room. He would also be the first to leave after the class was over. So one day, Mr. Christensen asked Steve to stay after class so he could talk with him. And after class, Mr. Christensen pulled Steve aside and said, "You think you're pretty tough, don't you?" And Steve's answer was, "Yeah, I do." Then Mr. Christensen asked, "How many push-ups can you do?" Steve said, "I can do, I guess, as much as I want, but I do 200 every night." 200? He said, "Man, that's pretty good." Mr. Christensen said, "Do you think you can do 300? Steve replied, "I don't know. I've never done 300 at a time." He says, Do you think you could?" "Well, I can try," said Steve. "Can you do 300 in sets of 10? I need you to do 300 in sets of 10 for this to work. Can you do it? I need you to tell me you can do it," Mr. Christensen said. So Steve said, "Well, I think I can. Yeah, I can do it." Well, Mr. Christensen said, "Good. I need you to do this on Friday." Now, Friday came, and Steve got to class early and sat in the front of the room. When class started, Mr. Christensen pulled out a big box of donuts. Now, these weren't the normal kinds of donuts. These were those extra fancy, big with cream centers and frosty swirls. And everyone was pretty excited about it because it was Friday, the last class of the day, and they're going to get an early start on the weekend. Mr. Christensen went to the first girl in the first row and asked, "Hey, Cynthia, do you want a donut?" And Cynthia said yes. Mr. Christensen then turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Cynthia can have a donut?" Steve said, "Sure," and jumped from his desk to do a quick 10. Then Steve again sat in his desk. Brother Christensen put a donut on Cynthia's desk. Mr. Christensen said then he went to Joe and the next person and asked, "Joe, do you want a donut?" And Joe said yes. Mr. Christensen asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups?" Steve did 10 push-ups, and Joe got a donut. And so it went down the first aisle. Steve did 10 push-ups for every person before they got their donut. And down the second aisle till Mr. Christensen came to Scott. and Scott was the captain of the football team and center of the basketball team. He was very popular and never lacking for female companionship. When Mr. Christensen asked Scott, "Do you want a donut?" Scott's reply was, "Well, I can do my own push-ups." Mr. Christensen said, "No, Steve has to do them." Then Scott said, "Well, then I don't want one of them." Mr. Christensen then turned to Steve and asked Steve, "Would you do 10 push-ups so Scott can have a donut he doesn't want?" Steve started to do 10 push-ups and Scott said, "Hey, I said I didn't want one." Mr. Christensen said, "Look, this is my classroom, my class, my desk, and my donuts. Just leave it on the desk if you don't want it." And he put a donut on Scott's desk. Now by this time, Steve had begun to slow down a little bit. He just stayed on the floor between sets because it took too much effort to getting up and down. You could start to see a little perspiration coming from his brow. Mr. Christensen started down the 3rd row. Now the students were beginning to get a little angry. Mr. Christensen asked Jenny, "Jenny, do you want a donut?" And Jenny said no. Then Mr. Christensen asked Steve, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Jenny can have a donut that she doesn't want?" Steve did 10. Jenny got the donut. By now, the students were beginning to say no, and there were all these uneaten donuts on the desk. Steve was also having to really put forth a lot of effort to get these push-ups done for each donut. There began to be a small pool of sweat on the floor beneath his face. His arms and brow are beginning to get red because of the physical effort involved. Mr. Christensen asked Robert to watch Steve to make sure he did 10 push-ups in a set because he couldn't bear to watch all of Steve's work for all those uneaten donuts. So Robert began to watch Steve closely. Mr. Christensen then started down the 4th row. And during his class, however, some students had wandered in and sat along the heaters located on the sides of the room. When Mr. Christensen realized this, he did a quick count and saw 34 students in the room. He started to worry if Steve would be able to make it. Mr. Christensen went on to the next person and the next and the next. And near the end of that row, Steve was really having a rough time. He was taking a lot more time to complete each set. Steve asked Mr. Christensen, "Do I have to make my nose touch on each one?" Mr. Christensen thought for a moment. "Well, they're your push-ups. You can do them any way that you want." And Mr. Christensen went on. A few moments later, Jason came into the room and was about to come in. And all the students yelled, "No, don't come in, stay out." Jason didn't know what was going on. Steve picked up his head and said, "No, let him come in." Mr. Christensen said, "You realize that if Jason comes in, you will have to do 10 push-ups for him." Steve said, "Yes, let him in." Mr. Christensen said, "Okay, let me get Jason's out of the way right now. Jason, do you want a donut?" Jason said, "Yes." "Steve, will you do 10 push-ups so that Jason can have a donut?" Steve did 10 push-ups, very slowly, with great effort. Jason, bewildered, was handed a donut, and he sat down. Now, Mr. Christensen finished the 4th row, then started among those seated on the heaters. Steve's arms were now shaking with each push-up in a struggle to lift himself up against the force of gravity. Sweat was dropping off his face, and by this time, there was not a dry eye in the room. The very last two girls in the room were cheerleaders and very popular. Now, Mr. Christensen went to Linda, the second to last, and asked Linda, "Do you want a donut?" Linda said very sadly, "No, thank you." Mr. Christensen asked Steve, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Linda can have a donut that she doesn't want?" And grunting from the effort, Steve did 10 very slow push-ups for Linda. Then Mr. Christensen turned to the last girl, Susan. "Susan, do you want a donut?" Susan, with tears flowing down her face, asked Mr. Christensen, "Can I help him?" Mr. Christensen, with tears in his own, said, "No. He has to do it alone." "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Susan can have a donut?" As Steve very slowly finished his last push-up with the understanding that he had accomplished all that was required of him. Having done 350 push-ups, his arms buckled beneath him and he fell to the floor. Mr. Christensen turned to the room and said, "This is how it was with our Savior, Jesus Christ. He said to the Father, 'Into thy hands I commit my spirit,' with the understanding that he had done everything that was required of him. He collapsed on the cross and died, even for those that didn't want his gift. And just like some of those in this room, many chose not to accept the gift that was provided for them.